Hello and welcome to the Lifeline program. You're watching CVR English with me, Idris, and today we are going to discuss on coronavirus and its impact on street vendors and their businesses. The lockdown in the country came down harshly on street vendors as it did for many others who were in the city. Massive informal economy got affected. Announced on 24th of March, with just 4 hours notice, an empty city meant that street vendors immediately lost their sources of income and were confronted with hunger and deprivations. Some vendors, fruit and vegetable sellers, began venturing out after a few days without explicit permission and immediately faced police harassment. After a few weeks, the government eased the restrictions and essential vendors were being permitted to vend, due in large parts of advocacy of vendor organizations and activist networks. However, the cost of doing business as well as the risk has gone up significantly, with vendors not having access to wholesale markets and suppliers and having to spend more on travel costs due to travel restrictions in the place in the city. Also, with lockdown still partially in place, the number of buyers has gone down and so have earnings. Due to the harsh summer heat, perishable fruits and vegetables also have a reduced shelf life, so vendors are unable to capitalize on whatever produce they have. The state has recently announced a stimulus package of 5,000 crore rupees for nearly 50 lakh vendors, acknowledging the grave impact of loss of livelihood. The intended relief for vendors will be a credit loan that will provide an initial working capital of 10,000 rupees for all vendors, but it is not sufficient. Instead of credit, the government should think of converting it into direct income benefit, a cash grant as livelihood support to start the income activity in a regular way. The vendors need income support to be able to restart work, and if they are not able to do so, how will they return the loan? In the face of the ever-changing crisis, vendor organizations have to step forward and advocate for vendors to be provided the source that they need to be able to resume their livelihoods. To end this, vendors organization could consider the following for an advocacy agenda. Livelihood promotion for all vendors, including those selling non-essential goods. The impact of COVID-19 has been harsh on informal workers who have exhausted their capital and earnings in trying to feed themselves during the extended lockdown period. Vendors need to be able to resume vending for survival, and the government should take steps to begin to reopen markets and allow vendors back on the streets. Meanwhile, the number of street vendors in Chennai has reduced by 34% during the pandemic, disrupting the sale of essential commodities at affordable rates for residents in many zones. According to the data compiled by Greater Chennai Incorporation during the COVID-19 pandemic, 7,965 street vendors who had been selling essential commodities such as vegetables and fruits have stopped their business in the past few months. The street vendors selling anything from food to clothes is a common sight across the country. These include, but not limited to, the tiffin centers. Once upon a time, office adda for many the fruits, vegetables sellers, the famous chat shop across the road, and numerous juice, chai, coffee points easily spotted selling on the street corners, footpaths, local markets, or even carts that deliver at home. In the present scenario, when the whole world has to stay at home, these vendors on road are among the groups that are worst affected. Without the luxury of work from home, the livelihood of the majority is critically hit. A handful of these street vendors are still playing their part as the last link in the supply chain, making sure essentials like vegetables and fruits are still accessible. Albeit this also entails being at front line of the risk. Meanwhile, a vendor on roadside often is not affected in singularly. The act of vending usually involves multiple members of the family. The items vend, such as affordable food and clothing, are vital for the survival of marginal sections of the society, including urban poor. Street vending has also been a cultural insignia of many cities, and to those who can afford greater luxuries, also an occasional engagement. Safe to say, their presence is vital in keeping a chunk of our economy and its people going. And then while the estimate of the losses incurred by most sectors is analyzed in depth, thanks to the availability of excessive data and information about the formal economics, the plight of informal sectors is tough, in fact, to gauge, and due to the lack of data, this is best understood by analyzing the implementation of the Street Vendors Act 2014, which aims at providing the livelihood protection and favorable regulatory framework for street vending in the nation, and is implemented by the local municipal bodies. Thus, despite all the good intentions, the actual benefit of the special schemes such as credit linkage facility under Atmanirbhar Bharat and social security measures under Street Vendors Act may not reach the major proportion of the vendors unless the implementation is strengthened. Ease in policy implementation largely depends on having the right database of the beneficiaries, although the challenge will be to assure this ease and post-pandemic society with the economic crisis had already strained manpower. Meanwhile, the district administration, municipal corporation, panchayat raj department and the beneficiaries should act properly. The street vendors are the first point of contact in the supply chain for consumers, and in this time when public scrutiny and for hygiene is bound to be high, it becomes crucial to provide appropriate training to the vendors on safety and hygiene, and adopting innovation in vendor certification like FSSAI standards to increase the general public confidence on the street vending. The unprecedented COVID situations have paved the way to new approaches and innovations in problem solving. The local body too will have to adopt new mechanisms in order to sustain the economy and support anti-dia, the last one, in order to curb the damage of pandemic on the informal sector. According to the ILO report, in India, more than 40 crore informal workers may get pushed into deeper poverty due to COVID-19 outbreak, and sectors such as hospitality and accommodation, retail and wholesale, business services, construction and industry has suffered drastic consequences with a decrease in production and loss of hours and employment figures. In total, 1.25 billion workers in these industries. More than a third, that is 37.5% of the world's workers, are at high risk. The condition of low-paid and low-skilled informal workers is very worrying in the low and middle-income countries, where industries and services employ a large proportion of the workers, who account for 61% of the global workforce, or 2 billion people, and lack social protection or a safety net. As informal workers struggle to survive amid the current crisis, there is good reason to believe that the post-crisis period will put additional pressure on the already fragile sector. The consequences of the COVID-19 outbreak for the informal economy will continue faced with a protracted crisis. The world economy is likely to depress demand for products and services from informal sectors enterprises. The impact of the pandemic and its aftermath on women street vendors has also been foregrounded through a recent study conducted by the Institute of Social Studies Trust and JINPAL. The study aims to understand the impact of the lockdown on the paid and unpaid care activities of the women workers, and also the impact on the access essential services. Then resources and services. There are roughly 2 crore. Recent numbers estimate close to 4 crore hawkers in India. 1/3 of this population consists of women street vendors, who mostly sell their wares in weekly halts, streets, roadside stalls, or by helping their families, husbands in the back-end work. The lockdown in the country came down harshly on the street vendors as it did many other workers in the city's massive informal economy, which was announced on 24th of March with just 4 hours of notice. An empty city meant that these vendors immediately lost their source of income and were confronted with hunger and deprivation. Some vendors, fruit and vegetable sellers, began venturing out after a few days without explicit permission and immediately faced police harassment. After a few weeks, the government eased restrictions and essential vendors were being permitted to vend due in the large part of the advocacy of vendor organizations and activist networks. However, the cost of doing business as well as the risk has gone up significantly, with vendors not having access to wholesale markets and suppliers having to be spent more on travel costs due to travel restrictions in the place of the city. Also, with the lockdown still partially in place, the number of buyers has gone down and so have earnings due to the harsh summer heat. Perishable fruits and vegetables and have reduced the shelf life, so vendors are unable to capitalize on whatever the produce they have. The state has recently announced a stimulus package of 5,000 crore for nearly 50 lakh vendors, acknowledging the grave impact of their loss of livelihood. The intended relief for vendors will be a credit loan that will provide an initial working capital of rupees 10,000 for all vendors, but this is not sufficient. Instead of the credit, the government should think of converting it into direct income benefit, a cash grant as livelihood support to start the income activity in a regular way. vendors need income support to be able to restart their work, and if they are not able to do so, how will they return to the loan? In the face of the ever-changing crisis, vendor organizations have to step forward and advocate for the vendors to be provided the resources they need to be able to resume their livelihoods. To end this, vendors organizations could consider the following for an advocacy agenda. Livelihood promotion for all vendors, including those selling non-essential goods. The impact of COVID-19 has been very harsh on informal workers who have exhausted their capital and earnings in trying to feed themselves during the extended lockdown period. Vendors need to be able to resume vending for survival, and government should take steps to begin reopen markets and allow vendors back on the streets. The number of street vendors has reduced by 34% during the pandemic, disrupting the sale of essential commodities at affordable rate of residents in many zones. According to data accomplished by the Greater Chennai Corporation during the COVID-19 pandemic, 7,965 street vendors who have been selling essential commodities such as vegetables and fruits have stopped their business in the past few months. Well, those were the latest updates of this hour. Thank you for watching this program. Take care.